We're glad to have everybody here tonight, and we have a real treat for us. Miss Betty Whitfield King is going to address us all, and I guess without further ado, we turn this over to you.
Okay.
Miss King.
Well, you have no idea how glad I am to be here this evening. It's been over 70 years since I got to wear my good black dress. Oh, Lord, you don't know how hard it is to keep one from getting wrinkles when you put it down in the box. Let's see, I'm Betty Whitfield King. I was born in Camden, Tennessee, 1871. My father was Dr. Frank King, and he graduated from Shelby Medical School in 1861. When he got through, he joined the Confederate soldiers, but he never served as a medic. Now, he was wounded during the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, if you want to correctly know. But he was wounded, and then when he got through with the war, got his wounds healed, he came back to Camden, Tennessee, where he married my mother. My mother was Margaret Williams, and education was extremely important in my family. And y'all really don't know how lucky you are to be in Hopkins County. Did you know at one time or another, Sulphur Springs had 3 colleges? Now, I'm going to tell you about one of them. I didn't come here to talk about myself. I came to talk about a great educator here that lived in this town at one time. Let's see, let's go back a ways now. There was a man by the name of L.D. King, Captain L.D. King, mind you, that went to a campaign speech by Sam Houston. And he was just eaten up with it, to say the least. He was so thrilled that when Sam Houston quit his speech, he said, "Now, I had a son born this morning, and I'm going to name him Sam Houston." Well, Sam Houston said, "Yeah, I'd be flattered, but I'm not sure you want to saddle a baby with the name of Sam Houston." But he did anyway. And the family lived out in the Tarrant area. Captain L.D. King was a lawyer, and his partner was Lieutenant J.K. Milam. And Sam would always say, "Well, didn't get much education out in Tarrant." Well, I don't think it was the school's problem. I think Sam wasn't really interested in much education. So when he was 9, Tarrant was kind of dying and Sulphur Springs was growing. So when Sam was about 9, he moved into Sulphur Springs because his daddy moved his law office to Sulphur Springs. And Sam said, "Well, that's when my schooling really started." I think he finally was 9, old enough to know he didn't need to realize that he needed an education. Well, he said he went to the Looney Institute, was the last school he ever went to. And he graduated from the Looney Institute. It was a small class. But then I'm not sure if his memory was slipping a little, or maybe he just kind of stretched a few things. Because the tale I heard from him and from his family was he spent 4 years studying medicine. In fact, he wrote it himself. Wrote it down in a letter. He said, "I spent 4 years studying medicine, but then times got hard and I couldn't afford to keep at it. Then I spent 4 years studying law." Now, the truth be known, he probably studied law his whole life because he probably sat in his daddy's office a lot of the time. But then the story went on that he took the bar in open court and passed it. But he was too young to get a legal license. Now, if I count right, he would have been 10 when he graduated from the Looney Institute, if that was the truth. But I think the story just got stretched a little. Well, then he said he came to his senses. And He took care of the disability of being a lawyer and decided he was in love and he'd get married. Well, if he's going to have a wife and a family, he needs something a little more noble. So he went into what he called the second most noble profession. The most noble profession is a minister. The second is a teacher. So he became an educator. And he married Ava Neely, whose father was a Methodist minister. He filled lots of pulpits, but he was a Methodist minister. He married in 1880. Now, he and Ava had 7 girls. All of them but one of those 7 that were born alive lived to be an adult. And all of them but one was born in Texas. His daughter Ruth was born in Colorado because in 1895 he went to Colorado to be the president of a prestigious Methodist institute. Well, he stayed up there 1 year. But let's go back a little. Sam taught all over Hopkins County. And Wood County too. He started out, well, let me just give you a few of the highlights. He was actually superintendent of the Sulphur Springs schools at one time. Then he went on to become a teacher at Sulphur Bluff. He taught at Central College. He taught at lots of places. But when he went to Colorado, and when he came back, he started King's Collegiate Institute of Tarrant. Charged $9 a month, room and board. But the problem was in Tarrant, there wasn't a lot of money to send the kids to school, so he had trouble getting enough students that he could make a living. So from there, he moved on to Como, because Como at that time was a thriving community. When he got to Como, he started another institute. He started another institute. But Ava died in 1900, leaving him with 7 little girls to raise. Well, I came along about that time. I started my teaching career in Tennessee. I taught there for several years. Went to Peabody Institute, which is part of Vanderbilt nowadays. Then I started teaching school. I went to several places. I went to the Normal Institute in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, for those of you that don't know, Normal has something to do with education. You may not realize, but at one time, let's see, Texas A&M Commerce, I believe it was called Mayo Normal School. So it's come a little way since then. Well, I went through normal school, kept my teaching certificate up, and then I went to a special school, Bethel Institute, because I was going to help start a seminary, a woman teaching in a seminary. Well, I went to a special school to get my credentials, and I started teaching the next year in a seminary. Well, it was Benton Cemetery, still in Tennessee. But by that time, I began to hear about all these people that had come to Texas. And a lot of those people were from where I grew up. And they would come back and they'd tell us about Texas. So in about 1900, I got on the train and I moved to Texas, leaving my mother and my sister still in Tennessee because my father had died several years earlier. Well, I got out there got to Texas, and I took a job at Peerless. You know, right down the road away. Well, I took a job there, and I taught 92 and 93. at Peerless. Well, you see, I happen to have all the qualifications that Sam King needed as a wife. I was 12 years younger than he was. I didn't have any children. I was healthy, and I was well educated. What else would you want in a wife? So, we got married. Now, when we got married, there was a tale he wanted to tell me about his mother. Well, it seems that his mother, for those of you that, Sam's mother was a Hopkins, okay? His father was L.D. King, but his mother, Mary Ellen Hopkins, was Eldridge Hopkins' daughter, which made him something special, because Eldridge Hopkins is where we got Hopkins County. Well, when Sam's mother was about 15, her daddy, Eldridge Hopkins, which happened to be the county clerk at the time in 1848, issued his daughter and Frank, Frank. I'll remember it in a minute. Anyway, issued them a marriage license. And a short time later, they had a baby girl. Well, it seems that Frank was the sheriff. And in 1849, while he was sheriff, you see, Sam's mother had already been married. So in 1849, so the whitewash story and the one that came down through the family said that Frank, being sheriff, had gotten in a fight with a man, and during the fight, the man fell and hit his head. Now, there's two facts I know about this story. One, the man was dead, and the second thing, Frank ran, never to be seen again. Well, a few months later, his wife, at that time, Sam's mother, had her second little girl. So he was gone for 9 years, and finally, Mary Ellen Hopkins married L.D. King. But she had a little past. She came into the marriage with two little girls. And Sam King was their firstborn child. Well, I didn't know this story really until after I got married. You know, I thought this was a really upstanding family, which they were. They stood up most of the time. Well, after we got married, we lived in Como for quite a while, and he taught, and Sam had his institute, and every so often I would go out in the country and teach for a few months and board. Well, in 1910, we moved in to Sulphur Springs. We lived on Depot Street, which I think y'all call Oak Avenue. Well, we lived out there on Depot Street about the same time that Carnegie Library was built. Well, Sam was put on the board of Carnegie Library. And our first part of our institute was in 1910, and Sam and I taught upstairs above the library. Well, in 1911, we bought land on Gilmer, and Sam borrowed $2,000 to build Sam's private school. So in 2011, he built the private school. But there's a little bit more to that story. You see, that was $2,000 borrowed. He had me. So I went out around Como and started teaching again. I would board Monday through Thursday, teach, come home on the weekends, and I taught until 1919 when the debt was paid off. But you've got to realize country schools only met 4 to 5 months a year, and I brought in money, and then when I was home, I taught school. Now during that time, my sister died back in Tennessee, and so I brought my mother in 1914 to live with us. So she was there when the girls came and went, which gave me more freedom to teach. Well, Sam's school was really kind of special. He specialized in kids, or really young adults, that had for some reason, no fault of their own, not gotten much education growing up. And he took those kids in and he taught them that if they wanted to be something, they needed an education. So he spent time, and he would often spend hours when somebody that he thought wasn't through with their education would want to move on. In fact, Judge Grover Sellers was one of those students that he had. He had a third grade education before he entered the institute. And several times, Mr. King would talk to him and say, look, you need to stay in school because you can make something of yourself. Now, Sam had a lot of students that really did make something of themselves. He could add a list of judges, professors. Dr. Frank Long was one of his students. Dr. Thomas was one of his students in Dallas, worked in Dallas, in Baylor Hospital. And he could just name a list. In fact, if you went back and looked at what your grandparents or your great-grandparents, you might find some of them went to his King's Collegiate Institute, which was often known as King's Collection of Idiots. But those people that didn't want to flatter him too much. But he taught for many years. He taught until end of 1926 when he retired. But now Sam wasn't just an educator. He was also a lay minister. Sam preached in churches all the way from Denver, Colorado, all the way to Tennessee. When a church had their preacher out, they would often look for him. He was a licensed lay minister. Yes, he taught. He also taught the Bishop Ward Sunday School class at First Methodist Church. I think it was called the Bishop class when he was there. And they had a huge group of businessmen. He was a member of the First Methodist Church for at least 60 years. It was the Methodist Episcopal when he first started. He not only taught and preached, but he was also an Oddfellow, a Mason. He also was, he was in the state legislature in 1927. He served as the chairman of lots of committees. In fact, I think he might roll over in his grave because he was the chairman of the Prohibition movement in Hopkins County. Now, Hopkins County was one of the strongest Prohibition counties anywhere around. Don't you imagine what he'd think if he went to downtown today? In the shadow of the Methodist Church, Baptist Church? Ooh, I wonder what he'd think. But he also was, he was a speaker, he was president, he was chaplain of the Old Settlers Reunion. His dad had been a Confederate soldier. He served as president of the Confederate Soldier League or group. He just went on and on. I mean, he never ended what he did. He was always into things. But after we retired, we lived down, well, to start with, we lived on Gilmer Street. Now, the land went all the way through to the back, and his school was on Quitman Street, or you probably call it South Davis. So that's where we lived. Next door, there lived some people named Ike and Willie Deaton. They had a little boy, one boy, and then they had another little boy born in 1930. Well, Miss Deaton came down with tuberculosis. And so I spent a lot of time kind of helping take care of the boys. And in 1932, the doctor told her, if you don't go to a dry climate, there's no hope for you ever recovering. Well, she had a 17-month-old baby, a little boy named Edmund. I came to our fence. We were really good friends, but he came to our fence and he handed Edward to me when he was 17 months old. Because she wasn't able to take care of him. He had to work and make a living. The older little boy was old enough that he could stay with, they had some relatives out there, so he could stay with them. But starting when he was 17 months old, he came to live with us. Now remember, this is 1932. I was born in 1871. My husband was born in 1859. And we take a 17-month-old little boy. I used to have a cow out behind the house. And Edmund wanted to go. As soon as he got ready, got where he could follow me everywhere I went, he did. Well, Edmund liked to follow me out when I milked the cow. So I'd go out to milk the cow because Edmund liked the warm milk. So he followed me out to milk the cow every day, and I would get him a dipper of warm milk, and he would drink it. That went on for years until I got blood poisoning in my left hand. I got blood poisoning in my left hand, and it would no longer grip. It was frozen. It was not usable. And so we had to buy our milk after that. So Edmund quit going to the barn. Now, when he was almost 6, I took Edmund back to Tennessee. Well, on the railroad, under 6 went free. While we were in Tennessee, Edmund turned 6. So I had to pay half fare. Now, I never realized what Edmund thought until long later. And Edmund said, he called me Miss Bettie. He never called me Mom. He said, Miss Bettie, I knew when you paid for me to come back home, you meant to keep me. Well, his mother died when he was 4. 2 years later, his dad remarried. And so his dad, Ike, and his new wife, Ike Deaton, and his new wife discussed what should we do about Edmund. Should we get him? Should we leave him? And then they came and discussed it with us, and we decided for Edmund's sake that we should leave him where he is, with us, because I was the only mother he had ever known. So Edmund stayed with us, and we lived there on Gilmer Street until he was 12. Now that old building, you remember I told you he built a school? That building was the first home for Davis Street Baptist Church when it was formed. And then a few years later, they bought the rest of the land for everything else they have there at Davis Street Baptist Church for my mama, for me and my husband. Well, we moved down the street, down where Davis Flower Forest is. That's where he moved when he was 12, and he lived there until he finished high school. Now, sometime in that period, they had owned 3 houses and lots, and so they sold their land back up next to where Davis Street was. They sold that land to Murray or Waskey Funeral Home. So now you know where they are. Well, Edmund grew up joined the Navy, and went off. And my husband, Sam, died in 1950 at the ripe old age of 91. Well, I continued to live in that same house. And I made my will out that my stepdaughter Gladys and Edmund would inherit each half of the house, with the understanding that Gladys would pay Edmund for that house, for half, which she did. Well, you remember Edmund's mother died of tuberculosis? I contracted tuberculosis. And they sent word to Edmund, who was living in San Diego after he'd gotten out of the Navy. He came back to stay with me while I was dying. They wouldn't let him stay with me because I had tuberculosis. They told him he had to stay across the street. But as Edmund said, he spent most of the time with me. Well, when I died in 1954, Gladys paid Edmund for the house. And Edmund, all the time he was in college, all the time he was in high school, he would spend a few weeks every summer with his dad, and the rest of the time he spent with us. In fact, Edmund's dad, Ike Deaton, was one of my pallbearers. So, he was a great educator. And I really appreciate you for listening. But before I quit, I'm going to tell you something. I talked to a 92-year-old man today in California. His name is Ed Deaton. He talked like he was 30 years old. And I asked him, I said, I'd like to just kind of feel about your mother. And he said, well, wait just a second. He said, it might take 20 or 30 seconds. He said, and he got quiet for a second. He came back on the phone. He said, I had to stop and remember. And so he told me all sorts of stories. He's the one that told me about the cow. He's the one that told me about the hand. He's the one that told me about going to Tennessee and where the house was and where everything was. I know he's going to live to be 110. I know he is. But he's a magnificent person. And I didn't ask, but Rhonda might could tell me. Did he ever marry?
That I don't know.
He talked like he didn't. Because he told me about coming back to Sulphur Springs and living with what was a cousin of his, and they went and found the graves where everybody was and how wonderful it was. And he took a tour of Camden, Tennessee. And on the bus tour, he told the bus driver, he said, he couldn't explain what relation Miss Bettie was to me. He said, I told him my grandmother went to Peabody College here, Peabody Institute, and the bus driver announced to the whole bus, we're going to take a little side trip, and we're going to Peabody. Peabody, that's part of the Vanderbilt system now. So they went to Peabody, and he was just thrilled. But you know what he did, what a lot of people will tell you? And I'm going to tell you this as a genealogist. If you have any older relatives still living, ask them questions. Because when they're gone, there's no one to ask. Just remember that, because someday you'll wish you had. Now, I've got one last thing to say. September the 11th, we're having a brunch and a style show from vintage clothing, vintage. We're having everything from bloomers to 1776, probably to 1950s. But we're going to have a lot of people in costume, and we're having a real good breakfast too. So we would love to see you. And I want to tell you one other thing. Major and I are two of the youngest members. We need your help. So come volunteer. Thank y'all.